I am Yamato Cannon, and this is Muffin, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
The trouble with MonteCristo's CLG is they couldn't retain their strong identity for long enough. They didn't quite get the nuance of more cultured, refined elements overall, and they just couldn't last long enough. So in that sense, they're nothing like Gamer Supps. Like one of my favourite flavours, watermelon ice. It's got that sort of subtle flavour. It's got like kind of a bit of a mix that starts out somewhere and goes somewhere different, but not in an obnoxious way. And it definitely lasts long enough. You won't end up in relegations in life, as it were, if you're checking out the old Gamer Supps. At least that's what I say in the commercial. Use the code Thorin, Thorin, for 10% off your order. Now, I've been promising to do this series for a while. Basically, the proper launch of Narrative Mechanic, my series where I take what I think are like misrepresented, mischaracterised, maybe even twisted and misguided narratives, and I correct them. I set the record straight, and I show you using the wikis and history how I don't think that's the case at all. And one of them, this is a prime one I've wanted to do for years, is about MonteCristo's time coaching CLG from the summer of 2013 through to the summer of 2014. It was 3 splits worth and then a couple of other side tournaments. Now, obviously, MonteCristo is one of the all-time great colour commentators in League of Legends history, desk analyst, talk show co-host and host with me, friend of mine, obviously. I have, at the beginning, let's put a disclaimer here, I have an enormous conflict of interest in the sense that he is a friend of mine and a colleague of mine for not only this entire time, but like 8 years at this point in time. With that said, though, I think if you know me and my work, you know that I wouldn't just blow smoke up someone's arse. So you'll see, I'll certainly cover the good and the bad of this period of time. But when he was a coach, and that is another string to his bow, he was one of the first coaches in the West, and sadly, he is quite poorly remembered. I mean, sure, it got mixed in with some of the Renegade stuff later. But I think, like, first and foremost, it's because of how it ended in CLG. It ended with the team failing to make a deep playoff run and ending up in relegations. So if you don't know much about the behind the scenes, or you only knew the surface level details back then anyway, then you're going to think, right, the coach obviously did a bad job. That, like, double lift and Afro in. That was like one of the best bot lanes, right? Then also there's the fact that obviously Reddit and social media is littered with TSM fans, especially back then. We're talking about 2014. That might be like the zenith of TSM fans, since they'd gotten Bjergsen that year and they were able to double down and come back even worse. Then you've got all the losers on Reddit who have a mega inferiority complex, or the idea that Monte wasn't a pro, but he was like coaching pros, or that he could live in Korea and say like NA is shit, but then simultaneously coaching NA team. They wanted him to fail. And they wanted him to fail so they could say, see, he was wrong about all the things he said about NA generally and about Korea, and he just a dick-sucking Korean fanboy, and actually, like, he knew nothing about the game anyway. Then, add in, finally, there was also the whole thing where Reginald, the owner of TSM, did lie also and say publicly that Monte isn't even a coach. But let's get into this particular topic, shall we? So Monte joined CLG, Counter Logic Gaming, for the second split of the NALCS in around the 24th of July in 2013. In the first split, they'd managed to make the playoffs. They were a top 4 team in the regular split. Everyone thought, oh, it's only the big 4. And then everyone might know they lost to Vulcan and they finished in 4th place, I think. So then he came in, and when Monte joined, they did a whole bunch of roster moves. So they already had double lift, obviously. He remained, although actually he'd been in way worse form than you'd ever seen in his career to this point in time, where he was in the previous split, because that was the period in time where he'd had Afromu as his support, but Afromu at the time wasn't doing that great. He just switched from ADC. So Chauste, if you remember, was actually the jungler in that split and had been at IPL, etc., and that was the role he then swapped to at this point in time. Big Fat LP was the mid laner still, had been for the whole time in CLG, and the top laner, of course, was Hotshot GG, the owner of the team, right? But this was the first split where they convinced Hotshot to step back from playing and just be the owner of the team. So as top laner, they got in Nien Tonso, just called Nien here, who formerly had been an AD carry player, actually. This is what's bizarre about this team, if you think about it. Like, by the end, between Chaucer Doublelift and Afromu and Nien Tonso, like, man alive, how many role swaps this team had? But anyway, so they brought in Nien Tonso as their top laner. Spoiler, I wasn't a big fan of his later, but he was okay. They brought Big Fat LP and put him as the jungler now, right? That was okay to try because he'd been a legendary player, but it was always going to be fairly questionable in my opinion. He'd been the mid laner of the previous split, but he'd been dropping off year on year on year, and by now he was just some average to below average LCS level player. So I thought this was mad questionable, and especially because one of the big narratives around Big Fat LP, even when he was the best, was that whereas all the rest of them in CLG wanted to get a house and move in and practice and start competing with international teams, he didn't want to move into a team house as far as I remember. I think it was because he had like a long-term girlfriend or something. He didn't want to like live with a bunch of nerds. That's an issue, and obviously he ends up not being in this team soon enough. Mid lane, you then had Link, obviously the guy who was like the CLG Black superstar talent, like clearly was going to be a good player one day, but in the past he'd been too young. Now they're putting him properly in. Now he was a good player even in this split. He just hadn't fully developed. Like you could see he had to get over some like performance anxiety to play on stage a bit better, to do as well in the main games as he would in solo queue or in scrims. Then as you bot lane, you had the old classic from season 2. You had Doublelift, who had very good skills, but was maybe in a tough period in his career. Didn't help that he was playing loads of like Street Fighter and like Diablo or something instead of playing League of Legends and solo queue. But part of that actually was people like Chowster were also doing this. So support, Chowster role swapped back to support, understandably, because as a jungler he was alright, but actually this is the role when the game had fully developed that people actually thought he was the best at. People thought, right, it's a brain role. Chowster, one of the smartest players ever, was, by the way. But the problem is at this point in time his skills were really washed and he was sort of like a bit anti-clutch in big games. So even though he had a really good brain, it wasn't as good as before, and his whole personality, if you know Chowster, was built around the idea that like I am the best. It's like that meme where he said like, you know, like whatever, like everything I say is right. That kind of not only was like the meme, but it's kind of legit as well. There was a grain of truth that he was the guy where his whole thing was like, this guy, he was the Odysseus character. He's the one who you follow because he just knows better than everyone. He has the plan. But at this point in time, his skills have degraded and he's not quite the monster he once was. So that then ruined his dynamic with Doublelift because he was supposed to heavily lead the Doublelift dynamic and sort of control Doublelift's brain. But by now, Doublelift was getting good enough at the role itself. There's sort of a friction there, a power struggle. And like I say, Chowster hadn't even been playing this role the previous split. So in you come to Monte's first ever split. And remember, while they live in North America, in LA, playing in NLCS, Monte lives in Korea, is commentating OGN Champions and next year Masters. And then he's, during like mornings, doing all this coaching, doing remote coaching, watching VODs and listening to the comms and getting up and listening to the scrims. He's doing that while doing a full-time job as arguably the best in the world at his job. So you come to the first split they had, Season 3 summer here, and what do you know? Look, CLG finishes in 6th place, so it gets you into the playoffs, but not a good record. 13-15 record. That's not so good, right? Pretty bad overall. But you have to look at the rest of the league. So Cloud9, this was their first split. They were unbelievable, 25-3. Team Vulcan was super good, and they were one of the few teams to beat Cloud9. TSM was just 14-14, and they're third. So already that's a 50% win rate. And then the other two teams, Curse and Dignitas, are the big names. They're at the exact same level as CLG, so it's actually not as bad once you realise Cloud9 and Vulcan are super legit teams. Cloud9 wasn't there the previous split, and Vulcan actually was good in the previous split, and that's why they were able to come in. I think, didn't they? Let me think. Yeah, they came 4th overall. Yeah, that's right. Actually, oh, sorry, did I say CLG came 4th in the fast split? They came 5th to 6th in the spring split. Yeah, I got that detail wrong. So yeah, and so then you have the other squads, and here's one of the key things to notice as well. If you go over here and you look, and by the way, CLG was also one of the only teams to beat the Cloud9 team in that 25-3. If you go over and look who they played though, CLG, over here we are. So they got a losing record against Cloud9, easily the best team in the region. They got a tied record with Dignitas, that's okay. They got a losing record against Coast, which is bizarre because Coast is one of the worst teams in the league. They got a losing record against Curse, not so great. They got an even record against Vulcan, who's actually one of the best teams in the league, so okay, a bit better in that case. They had a winning record. They won every game against TSM, so that's actually very impressive. By the way, spoiler, at the end of the playoffs, TSM finishes 2nd this split. And then they had an even record against Velocity, which, yeah, admittedly isn't that good. So what's weird about this is there's only one team in the whole split CLG has a win record against. It's TSM. It's the main rivals. It's the ones who, by the way, to this point in time, have held it over CLG for like, what, a year and a half at that point in time? Like, it's been ages since CLG's been winning. So that at least gave fans some hope, like, oh, at least we're in the playoffs, hey, we're beating TSM, like, we're starting to get this roster together. Obviously, you don't expect to instantly have results when you bring in a coach, a totally new roster, and role swaps a bunch of different roles. But okay, we're in the playoffs. Let's see what we can do in the playoffs, right? Maybe we can actually get it going. Oh, wait a minute. 5th place? What happened? Well, here's what happened. Believe it or not, they drew TSM as their first opponent in the quarterfinals. The team they'd beaten 4-0 and they just got 2-0'd by them. This was the series, if people remember, where Link was a bit dodgy and then famously Chouster did the sauna fail flash where he just fucked the whole ult up and did it like into a wall and spun like a 197-degree spin or something. So that was basically where people started to be out on Chouster and thought it was a choker. In fact, I know Doublelift loves to pop off and tell all stories from back in the day. Here's a fun one for you. Doublelift actually was talking buku mad shit on Chouster too, but then him and his manager Kelby begged me to remove that section from the interview because Doublelift's someone who actually doesn't even think, in his own words, that he can be held responsible for what he said, and he thinks you made him say things. It's almost like he's an idiot. Then again, if you look at the fact that fucking Lena's got around right up his arse using him like a fucking sock puppet, maybe he can't be held responsible for what he says. Maybe other people just control his brain at all points in time. But anyway, the point is Chouster was going to be out at this point in time. The only upside was that at least they beat Curse in the 5th place match, so they didn't have to go into relegations like they had the previous split. Obviously, failing to even make top 4 in the summer split, CLG did not go to Worlds. Season 3 Worlds happened while they were all sat at home. You had Faker winning against Royal Club. You have Doublelift on the desk with Crepo. And who else was on the desk? MonteCristo, of course. So then you come to the off-season tournament. So we had one here. It was an IEM tournament in Cologne, Germany, run by ESL. It was IEM 8 Cologne. This was the tournament, if you remember, where it had 2 different formats. It had an amateur tournament, which was actually won by Copenhagen Wolves, which was Forgiven's team, against NIP, which was like Nuke, Dark and Mythy, and SK Gaming here was people like that was actually the N-rated Svenskeren lineup. I don't even know how those teams are allowed to be in an amateur tournament, but it's because at this point in time some of these teams weren't in the actual like EULCS, like SK had been relegated, so they're allowed to play. I always thought that was bullshit anyway. But in the main tournament, this was the one where, if you remember, Edward came back to Gambit Gaming and they tore through the tournament. Fnatic, actually, I think maybe they just put Reckless into the lineup at this point in time. Yes, Reckless had just come in. Obviously, he couldn't play that EULCS year. Cloud9 obviously still has the mega lineup, but they've just had the humiliation at Worlds, and then CLG comes along. Now, CLG at this point in time already made 2 moves. They made a swap out of Chouster, and they brought back Afromu. Interesting detail. Obviously, Afromu goes on immediately to become a really good support player, and that bot lane Rush Hour becomes mega, and it's now very fondly remembered, and he's still a player in the NALCS to this day. But what people might not know is, I remember at the time talking to CLG management and players, and I was told actually at the time that Doublelift really wanted Bloodwater, the support from Vulcan. Now it'd be XDG the next year, who I thought was a fantastic player, Bulgarian immigrant. Like, this guy seemed really, really skilled, great thresh. I can see why Doublelift would want him. If you can't have X-Special, next player you want is Bloodwater. But for whatever reason, they chose to go with Afromu and gambled on him. And you know what? It worked out. Bloodwater actually eventually just retired and went off into obscurity, whereas Afromu became a top support. Okay, it all worked out. Would have been interesting, though. The interesting detail here is the jungler, though. Tricks. Not Trick 2G, dropping dembos, later, bitch, all that shit, who I love, by the way. There's actually a guy called Trix who you've never heard of, just some jungler from NA, who they'd been like scouting in solo queue, and I think maybe like Link knew or some bullshit like that. And they were all telling me at the time, like, oh, it turns out to be good from tryouts. Like, we might use this guy. The problem was, like, it just turned out to be irrelevant. This wasn't really meaningful. So what happened? Why did they not go far in the tournament? Because they played against whoever this team is, Team Turkality from Turkey, and beat them. Then they played against Fnatic, and they lost 2-1. Hey, they still won a game off Fnatic with Expected, Soaz, Reckless, Yellow Star. Like, that's a fucking mega lineup of players. So, by the way, the next champion of the EULCS, if people don't know. But they lost 2-1, and so they finished 3rd to 4th. That's all they managed to do at this tournament. Then we had one more off-season tournament. We had the Battle of the Atlantic. This was a set of exhibition show matches where, like, if you finished 3rd in NA, you played the 3rd team in EU, and then 1st in NA played the 1st in EU, and at the end, out of these 5 games or whatever, you saw which region won the most, and that region won overall. Now, what's sad is, you actually had this stupid scenario where, like, North America won overall, but largely because the 2nd place team in Europe, Lemon Dogs, their players all went to NIP, so they were still counted as 2nd place, but then they put in all these, like, sub-players. And by the way, as far as I know, I don't think a single one of these players ever played again in the ULCS. I think Schleier had for AAA against All Authority, but he never did ever again. It was a shit lineup. And because they got to play TSM, that's actually how NA won this regional tournament overall. But anyway, the more important thing is CLG was there, but CLG by now has actually finally made a change. So they had the Tricks guy before as a jungler, remember? Well, guess what? He's now out, And in comes instead Dexter, who actually was on Lemon Dogs back in Europe and had gone to Worlds and played against T1, and Faker was in that group that there's no way he could get out because it was OMG and T1 in that group. So Dexter comes in as the jungler. This was the time period where you've made a big import from Europe. You're going to hopefully level up your skills. They played against alternate attacks. Team alternate, they call it at this point in time. By the way, these are all solid players. Every single one of these players is decent or had some potential at the time or was even a good player. And crucially, they lost in this particular match with their brand new lineup. But I will say, Creaton was basically the European doublelift. He was a really mechanically skilled AD carry. He was a bit up and down in terms of practice. And everyone said, if this guy really wanted to, he could have been amazing. People might know he used to be called Dota Pro, etc. He was the guy who played on Curse EU back when they beat the old Moscow 5 team. They were mega. So yeah, this team beats them. It's only an exhibition tournament also. Who really gives a fuck, right? So then we come, finally, to 2014, Season 4. We're coming to Monte's second ever split with the team. Now for this split, you'll see CLG's in third place over the regular split. Nice winning record. 18 games won, 10 games lost, 64% win rate. Finished the split with a 2-game win streak. You look at who they're playing against. They have a winning record against every team in the league except 2, and those 2 teams are Cloud9 and TSM, the 2 best teams in the LCS. In fact, the 2 teams who play in the final of this split. They're the only teams that have a winning record against CLG. Otherwise, CLG has a 3-1 record against every other team, including Falcon, XDG now, Curse, Dignitas, and then against EG, which is the bad EG, those former CLG EU players, and Coast, they have a 3-1 record against EG, and they swept Coast, the team that had trouble with them. The last split, this was a different lineup, admittedly. This is the one that I think actually, yes, already had Zion Spartan and Shifter, and they managed to beat them 4-0 in that particular scenario. So this split's going great so far. They're clearly the third best team. They're the third best team by 4 whole wins. The only teams better than them are the 2 best in the region, and with arguably the best players in the region. Everything's looking great. Obviously, XDG, who had been Vulcan last split, have tanked and done really terribly. They did that stupid role swap where Zuna went from AD carry to jungle, and Xmithy, one of the most legendary junglers ever now, in NA, went fucking ADC, and it just tanked the whole role, and then even Manclyde fell off a cliff, who'd been a very strong player. Then you look at the squad overall. Rush Hour bot lane was arguably the best bot lane in NA. You could have said in the West, but people would have said Yellow Star and Reckless in Europe because of the stats. You have the whole angle where Link was looking stronger as an individual player. CLG's looking like, hey, they should at least be going on a deep run in these playoffs. And what do you know? They did. Because in the playoffs, they started out with a match against Coast initially. So here we are. They're playing against Coast of Zion Spartan and Shifter and those guys. They 2-0 them. They go and play TSM in the semi-finals. TSM, a team that they've had their back and forth with, but had been beaten in the regular split. TSM wins 2-1, but that even actually belies how close it was, because CLG won the first game. They were up in the series. In game 2, it was quite an even game, and they had a fight in their base. If you remember, it was the one where I think Bjergsen was on Karma or something, and they just fuck up this fight, basically. I think Link slightly missed position at one point, and they just allow too many people to die, and it just ruins the game. And then the third game, if you remember, Bjergsen just smurfs in that game. TSM goes to the final. TSM loses, if you remember, to Cloud9, and High outplays Bjergsen a bit, and Cloud9 wins their second split in a row. So actually, this is totally fine from CLG. You've massively improved from the first split. You've made your roster moves. You start to beat all the other teams except the top teams. You've gotten yourself in the semi-finals. You put yourself in a winning position against one of the best teams in the region. You didn't win this time around, but that's okay. You go and you play the third place match. You win that 2-0 over Curse. So you're beating Coast. You're beating Curse. You're winning against everyone else. You've almost beaten TSM, and you finished third place in the split. If you're the coach, if you're MonteCristo, you're killing it, mate. You're doing a great job. And going into that summer split, remember, playoffs of summer split is what determines if you go to Worlds, top 3 teams. You just finished third in the spring split. If you can do that again, you're going to Worlds. And in fact, after how this split went, you should actually be thinking, hey, maybe we can get TSM, mate. Maybe we can actually go to number 1 for next split. So, okay, this is the split you'll notice. They don't talk about when they all say Monte was a shit coach, he never did anything, and they just failed at the end, and they were totally trash, blah, blah, blah. They never mention this particular split, do they? Okay, so let's talk about the rest, shall we? Then we have a roster move. Because look who's playing now if you go and look at CLG. There's all these players down here, and up here there's a Korean player called Seraph. So what happened was, Monte, this was possibly the big mistake of Monte's coaching career in terms of how it's remembered and what could have been if he'd gone any other route, basically. So he got this Korean prospect called Seraph as a top laner, who previously had played in the Najin organization. I think it was Najin Shield he was on, the one with Expression, etc., and later Save. And obviously, as a result, he'd gotten to 1v1 and trained with these top people, and he was thought to be someone who had some promise in Korea. And there was even like montages of him playing Nidalee, and he looked like he had good mechanics, some solo queue. And what happened was, he came to Monte, and this is one of the early cases where you would have people who knew sort of how to be an agent and put these people, the right names out there, and get them tested by Western orgs. And sometimes they'd trick you into taking these players. And he was sort of told, like, this guy has potential, and crucially the story goes, because he came to see Monte wearing a suit and sort of put on like some attention to detail and tried to be polite and professional, that impressed Monte, and Monte tried him out in a few games in Korean solo queue, and he was like, this guy's actually pretty legit. The problem is this: if you know who it could and maybe should have been, this could have been such a better move. So first and foremost, at the time, I was already friends with Monte, I had been to Korea. We were discussing, actually, after that first split, who could they get instead of Neon Tonso? Because Neon Tonso, in my opinion, wasn't good enough as a top laner. So who could you get instead to be like a world-class side laner, solo laner, and then suddenly you're going to have Link, Doublelift, and then some really good top laner. You're going to have a really strong chance of winning NA and doing something internationally then. So we decided, actually, there's a match going on in Europe that's perfect. Because in relegations in Europe, promotion series, you had NIP, who was like way too good in terms of raw, like individual players to be in the Challenger series. It was the one with like Zoro Zero, let me think, Nuke Doc made Mithy and freezes the bot lane, but famously their jungler was supposed to be Herkbot early on, who had some issues with his eyes, and then they just kept getting like 17-year-olds online doing really well, and then at LAN they'd have to take some bomb who wasn't good enough because it had to be someone old enough to play on LAN. So this team was way too good to be in promotion. So they had Zoro Zero, arguably the best Western top laner, and then on the other side of the match you had Millennium, who had some good players, and their top laner was Kevin, who'd been in the previous attacks lineup I was talking about before at the Battle of the Atlantic against CLG, and he's just a tenured, decorated player from his SK Gaming times, just a top quality top laner. So I remember saying to Monte, here's what we do. Whoever loses this game doesn't get into EULCS. We just go to them and say, instead of playing in Challenger, come and join CLG, get a top salary, and just win NA instead. So when Zoro Zero lost this game, we thought, yes, that's the better of the two players. But sadly, the story goes, when they went to approach him, he didn't want to play League of Legends anymore. And indeed, he never played another split of League of Legends. He retired after that. And that was the end of his career. And obviously Kevin just stayed in Millennium since they were already in the LCS anyway. And by the way, they even, I think, were like 4th place. They almost made it to Worlds that year. Actually, maybe that's nonsense. I'm thinking of Roccat there, actually. Yeah, I think I am. I'm thinking of Roccat, never mind. They were in 56th place, I think, that year. So the other thing as well is there was one other player that they could have tried, which was Odoamne was playing for Cloud9 Eclipse, which was the Challenger team at the time, and he'd already looked good on some of the lands. And I'd even remember interviewing him, and I told him, I can check this guy out. So famously, they had him duo with Dexter, but for whatever reason, Dexter just chose against him, and Monte went with Seraph. Now, if you could have gotten Zoro Zero or Kevin, like the ideal scenario, now we know what happened to Zoro Zero, is that Kevin Millennium lost that match, and instead Zoro Zero would keep playing because he's in NIP, but in a ULCS, and Kevin would play on CLG and be amazing, by the way, and also be German. We could even pair up with Dexter, etc. Or you could have had Odoamne, one of the most consistent top laners of all time, amazing weak side play. Imagine him playing with Doublelift. He later played with Forgiven for many years. So think about how many other ways we could have gone, but instead we got the Seraph story. Now, sadly, Seraph wasn't even really set up for success because of the meta in Season 4 went away from top lane carries. Like, their idea of a carry was playing like a fucking bruiser, like playing Shyvana or Renekton. So even though this guy was a Nidalee player, carry player, he had to play out of his 18 games 10 games of Shyvana, 3 games of Renekton, and 3 games of fucking Lulu. So he wasn't even in position to use his skills, and he was a bit shy, and there was a bit of a toxic environment, the whole like Doublelift being an arsehole, Link being passive-aggressive, Dexter just got there from Europe, Afro moves kind of like everyone's friend, but he doesn't necessarily lead the team. Like, man alive, this guy was just put on a fucking island to die, mate. This is terrible. It's like the end of fucking Frankenstein or something. So then, okay, we come to the split itself. Let's see how they did. Okay, they finished the regular split in 5th place. That's pretty shit, right? 13 and 15 sounded like the first split again from Monte. So if they fail in the playoffs, he began he ended how he began, and he was a shit coach after all. And if you just forget Spring, yeah, he was a garbage coach, wasn't he, Thorin? No, because let's look at this for a second. So they have a 13-15 record, and they end with a losing record against C9, the best team in the league and the reigning champions, LMQ, second best team, who've been the best team for most of the split, and then Curse, who finishes in fourth. So 3 of the top 4 teams are the only teams that have winning records against CLG. They were tied with EG, who wasn't good, admittedly, and TSM, who was good, and they had winning records against Dignitas, which is all right, and then Complexity, who cares, are in last place. But here's the problem. The standings are misleading. These are the final standings and with no context. So here's the key thing to understand. Let's go down here to where you see where teams are. So first of all, CLG led the LCS from week 4, you'll see here they're 7-3, through to week 9. Look, so 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So for 5 weeks in a row, CLG led the NALCS. They were at 13-7 at the end of week 8. Now, 5 out of 11, guys, that's the majority of the split. They were number 1. Then, TSM, let's go and look at them as a team. They never led the league at any point in time. Cloud9 led the league only in the last week. And then Dignitas led the league in week 2 and week 3. And LMQ led the league in week 9 and 10 and week 1. So all these teams got the different time to lead the league. It was a very competitive split. Basically, the playoff teams minus Curse were all very, very dangerous. They even proved to be dangerous in the playoffs, but no one knew at this point in time. And there were a bunch of teams that could have won the LCS, including CLG. And this is when they were at their peak. Now, here's the other detail people might not realise. That final result is after a week where the starters didn't even play. Because for week 11, admittedly, yes, they'd already had their losses the weeks before to drop down a little bit. But for week 11, Monte had the revolutionary idea to bring the team to Korea to practice Korean teams, which he was able to set up in scrims, watch the OGN Summer Finals, the one that was the banger between Samsung Blue and KT Bullets, and KT Arrows, sorry, who won, obviously, and then come back for the playoffs and try and use what they'd learned in the playoffs and be even stronger and then be going to Worlds through qualification. So what they did instead was use a bunch of subs, these players basically, Hotshot, Kox, Baby, Thinkward, Chowster came back, I think, I can't remember who the other one was, Thinkcard, sorry. Basically, these players came in as subs and they just lost every game, if people remember. It didn't really matter anyway, but it meant that they didn't have a very good record overall, did they? Didn't get to like an even record, even though they'd done so well throughout most of the split. So, okay, let's get to the next part of the story, because then we come, obviously, to the playoffs, right? Think about that. They've been away in Korea. Sounds great, but what do you know? They finished 6th place, last place in the playoffs. Now, there's no way there's possibly any context that make this seem reasonable, right? Or is there? So, look, CLG came home. They played against Curse, and they got 3-0'd by them. Curse is a team they're supposed to beat. Then they played the 5th place match against Dignitas, who, by the way, is Zion Spartan, Shifter. They'd already come over to this team from Coast from the previous split, and they lose to them, and they finish in 6th place, and they're in relegations, which basically, it was after getting out relegations that they'd signed Monte as a coach the previous year, and now they're back in relegation. So, terrible, right? How could you ever possibly explain that? Well, here's the problem. Before they played the playoffs, they were in Korea. And when they were in Korea, they had all these boot camp issues. And I'll link at the top of the screen. There was like a documentary, if I can find it, which showed like behind the scenes, I think it wasn't like chasing the cop or something. There was clearly like issues within the team. If people don't know, Link was basically a moody little sod and just wouldn't sort of communicate and properly scrim and put his heart into it. So even though they were getting scrims against the best teams in the world that Monte was securing for them and getting proper practice and working on tactics and different concepts in the game with their lineup so they could do well in the domestic playoffs, they dicked around, didn't properly practice, were moody, had fights, and then when they came home, are you ready? This is the worst one of all. Because while they were in Korea, Monte had arranged for them to watch the OGN final between KT Arrows and Samsung Blue. They came home, and instead of doing the comps Monte had worked on in scrims and drafted, they just actually drafted comps that were their fucked up version of what the teams were doing in that final in Korea. And as a result, they were shit against Curse, got completely outplayed in those zillion comps, didn't know what the fuck they were doing. And Link, by the way, after all that, had the audacity in that 17-page whiny document to be about how Monte was making, like, it's just a Civer comp, bro. Like, I wish you would just play the fucking Civer comp. So Monte was judged for his team, one point in time, one of the best in the league. Everyone forgets that because how it ends. Then he takes them to Korea to try and level them up, gets them the best practice, shows them the best games. They come home, they sabotage what he said, don't listen to him, do something totally different, fuck it up completely, blame him, and then at the end, fans go, yeah, well, Monte's obviously a shit coach. Mate, what's he supposed to do? He ain't a miracle worker. And in this scenario, remember, he's a remote coach. If they don't do what he says, like, there's nothing much more he can do in that particular scenario. It's not like he can play the fucking game for them. And by the way, last detail, he even offered to help them play in relegations and get promoted again before he left this deal, because it was realised, like, right, he's going to have to live in NA if he's going to coach the team again because the out's ended. And he didn't want to leave Korea at the time, so it was decided they're going to split apart. He offered to coach them in relegations and they didn't want his help. Now, that isn't the only reason why everyone hated on Monte, let's be real. Another reason is this tweet from Reginald, good old shitter Reginald, who now, 10 years later almost, it's actually 8 years, people are finally, the penny's dropping, maybe this guy's an arsehole and a liar and an idiot and a fucking imbecile who just says stuff and doesn't know what he's talking about. So he said, in August 25th, 2014, let's go and look at the games here, shall we, boys? Oh, what do you know? The 5th place game that Monte had been eliminated that exact same day, a day before. 3-0 by curse. And Reginald says it's common behind the scene knowledge that he doesn't actually coach CLG. Pretty much every pro knows it. No one can honestly deny it. Now, someone can honestly deny it because I even replied to that tweet and said, you're lying. I have personally seen him remotely coach the team while I was in Korea, which I indeed had. Now, supposedly, it was players within CLG. I think it was implied it was Doublelift who said some of that, maybe, and Link said some of that. Maybe even Dexter was in the mix somehow. I mean, I know I privately basically scolded Doublelift when I heard it was him, and I think Doublelift publicly said something like, oh, I'm sorry about that, Monte, I wish I'd support you. But the saddest thing about this was when Reginald said this lie like this, and Loco joined in, because Monte had said, yeah, no, Loco was a bit too young to coach a team like that, and so Loco had his beef with me and him from some of the insight. He also said some bullshit about Monte, and the real problem is this, it's not that TSM side came out in full force and spread the lies, and that's why people dislike Monte, thought he was a shit coach, but it's the fact that the CLG guys sort of like sold him down the river, as it were. Like Doublelift, CLG generally, Hotshot, they didn't come out hard to support him or battle Reggie, they just sort of let it happen. I mean, as I say, I chastised Doublelift, that's the only reason he said something later, from what I remember. So what happens was, on the 5th of September, Monte officially left CLG. Now here's the thing, fans talk like that was the last moment in Monte's entire career as a coach. Like, the last moment was his career. So because at the end they failed the playoffs, and they looked silly because of outgone being over in Korea and having the drama in the documentary, and then they go into relegation. People act like that was his whole coaching career. It was the relegation team and he was shit. He helped them develop the roster and get it to a good place. By the way, the next year they won the LCS with the core, the basic pieces that he had in his roster. He helped them get 2 import players, including a Korean and a top European. That isn't also easy to do. Could even have got some more elite import talent, but just zigged when he should have zagged. He had the best bot lane in the LCS in the rush hour bot lane. Link was developing despite having his issues and his attitude problems, which by the way were never resolved, and he basically flopped the next split under Skara as his coach and then was replaced with Pobelter, and CLG immediately won the LCS with essentially just a slightly worse version of Link himself. Again, how much of this is Monte's fault? They had a Korean bootcamp, brilliant idea, by the way, could have done so much for the team. They almost changed the game by going and doing that, and if this had worked, by the way, in the future, they were going to try and go to OGN for a whole split, potentially, but Riot banned the accounts and made sure that could never happen, and sort of closed off the entrance to this sort of secret Underground Railroad scenario to get over to Korea, as it were, which was a cool idea from Monte. So I think this was actually a very interesting story. You can see the ups and downs are way different how they were presented. Monte definitely, I think, did a good job coaching the team based on expectations, where they were when he began, what the zenith was, the chances to have done much more. And I think when you look back, look how badly done by he was with how people characterised it and how they remember the story after the fact. This video was supported by Kill Your Inner Loser, Travis Goff, Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Hades, Animosity, Joseph Ginsburg, Tobias Bernasconi, Bot Pounder 420, Jensen Goh, Kovacevicd, Pacy, Tosh, ochs, toucan, and a special thanks always goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? You want to ask me a question at one of my monthly AMAs? Do you want teasers, find out who the upcoming guests are? Or maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy esports discussions with moi? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Scrolluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.